Welcome back to BetterHelp's In-Session series. My name is Hesu Jo, and I'm a licensed therapist and part of the clinical operations team here at BetterHelp. Happy 2023, folks. Happy New Year. Hope you had a great holiday season. We've now entered into the new year, and there's a lot of timely buzz about self-improvement and habit change. Like many of us, you may be both excited and under some pressure to make changes. So we want to dig into this topic. To help us sort this out, we're honored to be joined by Julia D'Agostino. Julia is a fellow BetterHelp therapist, coach, supervisor, consultant, and advocate based in Lexington, Kentucky. Julia is rooted in abolitionist visions and values, meaning she sees how systems and structures impact our relationships to ourselves and to others. And she treats every individual as an expert in their own life. Julia uses cultural somatics, narrative, and other trauma-informed practices to move clients and communities towards individual and relational healing. Julia, thank you so much for being with us in our in-session series today. We'd love to get to know you a bit more and learn why you decided to become a therapist.
Thank you so much, Hesu. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here. My path to becoming a therapist was a windy one. I went to school actually to become better at community organizing and political advocacy work, but I became part of my program was to be put in field placements that I didn't really have control over. And my first placement was doing child and family therapy. And I found that I actually loved it and was really benefited by the work and felt really challenged by the work as well, very inspired. So I just continued on with it and followed that tangent of my life. And here I am, 15 or so years later, doing this work full time. So that was my path. Yeah.
Thank you so much for sharing that. That windy road, that windy journey feels so familiar. And I don't know about you, but a lot of therapists I've spoken to have something similar like that in their history. I haven't met a ton of people that decided when, they're 6 years old, when I grow up, I'm going to become a therapist. It's often because of something I was doing in my life, kind of set things in motion to get me where I am. And now when I reflect, it's almost like I didn't, it was like going with the flow of my life. And here I am. This is what is natural to me. So I imagine that means there's something about us as people that draw us to this thing, something about being in tune with change, positive evolution in self. And that's, part of our big topic here today. When we think of this idea of New Year's resolutions, and admittedly, I don't even know the origin of this stuff. I don't know where we started doing these things, like if it starts from a certain culture, because it seems pretty pervasive globally now, to feel like we have these pressures, or maybe that's too strong of a word, some kind of external motivation, a lot of times internal, to change stuff around this time of year. So, I'm wondering if you can help us break down how to navigate this kind of thing that happens around this time of year, and maybe for individuals, other times of years too, knowing if we're making changes for ourselves, for others.
Yeah, you posed a few fascinating research questions in that. So, why do people become therapists, and why is January or New Year's, why is that a place to form resolutions or make change? And, I believe that we are part of so many aspects of our environment and our culture. And there is something, at least in the Northern Hemisphere, about once the solstice passes, around Christmas, the days start getting longer again, and tends to be like seed planting. We're looking ahead at planting seeds, right? So I wonder if that has something to do with our collective consciousness, at least in the Northern Hemisphere, in terms of trying to start change processes now. Plus, who doesn't love the opportunity for a blank slate starting fresh? And why that is part of the new year, I cannot say. Certainly, there's no wrong time to begin behavior change, right? I agree, though. There really is, not just in the style of New Year's lore, creating resolutions. There's also a lot of advertising and marketing. There's a lot of external pressure that we see coming at us. And part of that might be living in a world where capitalism is king, and it's a great marketing strategy for selling certain things. So there might be some aspect of that happening here. However, I think in our field, especially, where anytime someone signs up to be in therapy, they are signing up to do something different, to make a big change in their life. So, as therapists, we're always open for that, even if it's not New Year's.
Yeah, I'd love to think that the changes that people make during their journey therapy or in their journey to improve their mental health stick. And I think as therapists, we certainly observe our clients to have progress that's not unidirectional, right? Like they'll make progress, they might have a step back. Life takes them in some challenging direction. They come back to feeling on track with everything. And it's just kind of all over the place. It's a windy road there also. And I think, in this time of year, we might be very interested to look at how effective are New Year's resolutions. Similarly, it's interesting to me because it makes me wonder, like, how effective is therapy? How effective are these goals that we make? But with therapy, it's such an individual journey. With New Year's resolutions, it can feel like, well, I'm doing it because I need to, because everybody else is doing it, because of all this marketing, like you're talking about, all this input stimulation, like these products want me to buy them to be healthier, have better skin, better hair, all that stuff. But interestingly, it looks like studies are actually showing that a large percentage of New Year's resolutions don't stick, or in other words, they fail. It doesn't end up panning out the way that we want. So, wondering what your thoughts on that are, and if there's any insight you can provide further about that.
Yeah. Wow, windy road might be the theme of this conversation, right? Everything is sort of windy in a sense. Um, I know there's a few different research studies out there about what makes behavior change last, what is sustainable in behavior change models. I think primarily for folks who are considering behavior change now and are looking at the messages that are most accessible to them, whether that's in social media, or other forms of communication, of mass communication. I think that one of the biggest issues that we run into is we want to simplify the issue. We want to call it behavior change, right? And leave it at that. The thing is we don't, no behavior exists in a vacuum of experience, right? That every behavior is connected back to thinking, feeling, and belief systems inside of us. And as you mentioned, we are very influenced by the context of our lives, which includes the microculture of how we grew up in our family or neighborhoods, and the macro culture of our nationality or region in the world, and it also includes other environmental and spiritual factors. So there's no simple way to talk about behavior, and therefore there can't really be a simple way to talk about behavior change if we're serious about it, right? So my perspective as a therapist, and I do think it is important to just side note that there is no one way to do therapy. There's no one way to change. And one of the most important tools for folks who are seeking using therapy to guide them in their behavior change goals is to remember that not every therapist is the same. And you really should find a therapist that you connect with and you align with the way that they think about the issue that you're coming to them for. So my way of thinking about it is really informed by the idea of somatics. So the idea that we have all these influences in our lives that make us who we are. We are not just ourselves and our bodies. We are our relationships. We are our communities and our culture, right? So in that way, one of the important steps for me in helping clients move towards change is giving them a greater self-awareness and understanding of why a behavior exists to begin with. Because I assume, based on my philosophy and treatment model, that every behavior happens for a reason. So we really need to focus on finding that reason. If we do not dig a little deeper, scratch beneath the surface, figure out more about what we've learned from our past experiences that made that behavior a habit to begin with, then we're going to be missing a really essential part of sustainable change. Because if every behavior does exist for a reason, then simply taking it away or replacing it with a new behavior without the context of, well, what are we trying? What is that old behavior doing? And what is this new behavior going to do that is the same as that old behavior, whether that's self-protection or a certain category of identity, whatever that is. If we don't have that element, then new behavior, we don't actually have a fullness of investment towards in our whole body and context of self. So in other words, we need to figure out the reason that a behavior exists to begin with if we want to change and do something different with our lives.
It sounds like we approach how to strive for lasting behavior change in very similar ways. Like when you're speaking of this, I'm thinking of like memories I have with my clients where I'm trying to get them to this place of understanding what purpose that behavior was serving. A lot of our clients are trying to change this behavior because they've at least figured out this isn't good for me. This is kind of destroying my relationships. It's getting in the way of my job. I can't sleep. I'm not eating well. Um, and a lot of times there's like this self-inflicted shame that comes with what is wrong with me? Why do I keep doing this thing over and over and over again? And then it sounds like both of us are trying to get the client to kind of uncover for themselves this whole thing. This has been effective for you at some point or another, right? It served some kind of function in a different chapter, in a different season in your life. It made sense at the time. And now you're starting to feel and figure out that it doesn't make sense now. But like you said, we can't just make it go away, right? It's something that's deeply ingrained, embedded into you that has gotten you where you are today. So for better or for worse, some of these things, while they're not working right now, it sounds like you really want to help your clients discover, and you're living it out too in your own life. It's very powerful. I can feel it here. Is that we got to figure out how to continue to, serve our purposes, fulfill these needs that we have, and hopefully do that in healthier ways. Um, so on top of all of these things, it sounds like in order to get somebody to make these lasting behavioral changes, turn something into a habit that they, enjoy doing, benefit from, is an understanding, a different understanding of what is even going on when they do this stuff. Do you have any other tips or things that you use when you're on this journey with clients in terms of getting habits to really last?
Yeah. I mean, perspective change is a really important component for sure, Hasu. And what you said about shame, oh, I mean, we could go in a whole other direction just about the impact of shame, right? We use shame so much in our culture. Shame is a part of our punishment rituals in our culture, right? And, all the research and evidence suggests shame is not useful and actually quite damaging.
Hmm.
And yet it's because it's a very present cultural narrative. Like we all have learned shame at some point in our lives and at different degrees, depending on our family culture, perhaps. We all have internal messages of judgment and shame. And that is a huge, being able to challenge that is a huge part of behavior change, I believe, is moving outside of a shame model. Um, and, you know, I'm really informed by neuroscience. And one thing that we know about the brain is that its number one function, the reason that it exists, is to keep us alive, is about survival, right? We now, at this stage of human evolution, have this enormous cortex, this part of our brain that has grown over tens of thousands of years that let us think good thoughts so we can be intelligent and creative. But ultimately, that's not the primary purpose of the brain. The primary purpose of the brain is to keep us alive. And so a lot of our behaviors that are habitual come out of a brain learning process, right? So an internal process of self-protection and survival. And so when you say things like, these behaviors serve me at some point, but they don't anymore, in a sense, it's important that we recognize, wow, you've made so much progress that you no longer want to rely on those survival strategies that your brain has created through these behaviors. Like you're ready to move out of a safety danger complex and into something to do with wellness, which is not a priority of the brain. The brain actually doesn't care if you're well. It just cares if you're alive. It's a different priority, right? So in some ways, changing behavior is struggling. It's a counter biological imperative for the brain to allow you to change behavior, because the brain is like, but no, I do this because it keeps me safe. So we have an uphill battle here, right? And because you and I frame it this way, if we are using a framework of this is about learning to be safe over time and then embodying a sense of safety that you don't need these old behaviors anymore to feel safe, right? If we take that approach, then we are inherently taking an approach of self-compassion, that we have a deep understanding that the reason for most of these habituated behaviors had to do with some experiences in life that really felt life-threatening at the time, even if they don't feel that way now. And so we can take this approach, we can see ourselves as just moving from self-protection into wellness. And that's kind of scary, right? So there's no one way, as we mentioned, to do therapy or to do behavior change. We can do it many different ways. We can use shame if we want. However, if we take an approach that, look, what this behavior is doing is inherently a part of my personal safety and a self-protective mechanism, then we can start to guide ourselves towards behavior change with a little more compassion. So for me, a really important part of sustainable behavior change is, again, understanding the underlying support that that behavior is giving us. So bringing what's under the surface to the surface, increasing our self-awareness. And also remembering that the brain is not going to let you do anything differently unless it feels safe. And so if we focus our efforts on understanding that safety is a feeling we need to have before wellness can happen, then we're going to be way more successful at a sustainable change habit or practice.
Incredible. Like mic drop. Like, so basically what you're telling me is that if you have unresolved childhood trauma, then no amount of bath bombs and sugary sweet treats and, going out and treating yourself is actually going to get to the root of the issue. And you may continue to feel unwell. You may, right? I really loved what you said about, this shift from self-protection to self-compassion. There were just all these moments where I was like, yes, yes, give me more. And, these really important and key features of understanding what's going on with your behaviors in the first place, um, and extending to yourself a sense of safety so you can start shifting into different things. Even this idea and this notion that our brain doesn't care whether we're, living well and being able to relish in life's beauty. It's really more about survival. Like you said, like that lizard brain is still with us. That lizard brain is what keeps us alive, like you mentioned. And I'm even getting like this sense of we're maybe sometimes a little bit too smart for our own good. That's what's going on, right? Our brain is like this powerful thing, but it doesn't always really do what we truly desire internally. Um, even
It's
like
not
a
about desire, it's about
right
survival, right?
survival, and
Yeah.
our bodies, our brains are so efficient, right? So like I remember a personal trainer even told me during an exercise, your body wants to do everything possible to conserve energy. Your body wants to do the easiest thing possible. And unless you're like really mindful and intentional about what you're doing with your movements, you're going to start slacking off. Your form's going to start going, in different directions because it's trying to conserve. It doesn't actually want you to lift as much weight as you can and do it in good form, keep your back straight, all that stuff. So it's so important to maintain safety consciously because it doesn't sound like that's what's a brain priority all the time. Um,
Yeah, that's right. And just to be honest, I love using movement and body metaphors because it is both figurative and literal in its application. We're saying the thing directly, and also when we consider how to do movement or exercise or physical activity, that there's a visual element to that can be really helpful for our own understanding. But there's two things that I wanted to add to that. It's important that we know that when the brain is experiencing, or when we are experiencing stress, the brain secretes hormones that actually shut down certain
Mm.
parts of functioning, including our prefrontal lobe, where our intellect and creativity really live. So, if we want to do anything that is connected to desire or to our values or our hopes and dreams, we need to be low enough on our stress scale that we can access those parts of our brain. And we learn not just through trauma. Certainly, there's people who don't identify as having a trauma history. Sometimes I just call it adverse experiences. So, whether or not you identify as having experienced trauma in your childhood, your brain was still very much interested in learning about the world, especially through adverse experience. So you can call it trauma or not. Even if you didn't experience trauma per se, you still have the same style of brain functioning as folks who did. And so this is still very applicable to people who would not consider themselves trauma survivors.
Thank you for adding that so much. It's so important to be inclusive in how we speak about what's going on with clients, because I'm sure you've had clients like this too who say like, I don't really know if I should be here. I don't feel like my problems are big enough. Like, I have this image, or they say things that make me feel that they think they have an image of people that have trauma. And these are the folks like big T trauma. These are the people that really deserve to be in therapy and deserve to feel better about themselves. I don't know about me. Like, these are, so everything
Yeah.
you're saying here like resonates so much for that. So I hope the folks listening in can extend this same space for themselves. We all deserve enlightenment, improvement, to feel well. And it sounds like we have to make a really conscious effort to do that because our brain's like not always on the same page.
Yeah. It
um
doesn't want change. So, yeah.
yeah, yeah, so it's like this weird thing where it's our brain that helps us process thoughts and all these things, and somehow it becomes still a challenge to stay honest with ourselves. um and we're talking about a lot of processes that happen for ourselves internally. But we also talked about how we are the product of who we are with. If you happen to go to therapy and your therapist is talking about systems and how you're part of a system, um, concept there is that who you are is often in the context of who you are with other people, relationships. So I'm wondering if you can share some of your expertise, insight, thoughts about this whole topic that we're talking about, but like how it's related to when we're involved with other people, just relational things, trying to hold people accountable, seeking that for ourselves from other people we care about. Really open to any of your thoughts there.
Yeah. Back to one of your original questions about why people find themselves in therapy. I think one thing that we know, not just from the literature, but from our own experiences, and making an assumption for you too, is that this process is about a relationship, right? If you don't want a relationship with someone to help you towards making change, you can just buy some self-help books. There's great ones out there. The thing that we do that self-help books don't do, because sometimes we offer the same advice and tools, is we connect with you as our client, right? And we form a relationship. And there are some key components to relationship, like trust, like consent for feedback, that we work with our clients. And so one of the most effective uses of therapy is simply developing a relationship with someone who, most therapists would say that their job is to hold their clients with unconditional positive regard for who they are and their humanity, right? You don't get to have that. Most people don't get to have that with people who are not therapists in their lives, whether we're talking about friends, partners, family. All humans, right, have their own issues. And inside of relationships, we experience conflict and tension. And we have a different sense of mutuality in our relationships with people who are not here for a transactional purpose, such as psychotherapy or coaching or something like that, right? We are looking for something out of those relationships that are not professional, that just doesn't exist in the therapeutic context, which is why your friends and your family members cannot be your therapist. And I can certainly vouch for the times when my friends and family would have loved for me to be their therapist or vice versa. And you know what? It just doesn't work. Even if you really want it to work, it just doesn't work because there's a different level of relational investment. It's just different, right? There's different social contracts in those relationships. And so as a result, what we do in therapy is a really special, and I consider it to be a sacred place, because whatever choices you make in therapy, your therapist is not really here to judge. Your therapist is not really here to tell you whether or not what you're doing is right or wrong. Your therapist is here to help you uncover your own values and make your own decisions about whether something is right or wrong, or healthy or unhealthy. Now, this is really useful for behavior change, especially if we are trying to change behaviors that have been habits for a really long time that are connected to childhood adversity or trauma, right? Because those behaviors are not going to go away overnight. And they're not going to go away just because you committed to them for the month of January, right? They're sometimes going to take years and lots of practice. And some of the self-care tips that you hearken back to, like take your bubble bath, drink your tea, snuggle up in a cozy blanket. It's not that those tips are wrong or that that advice is bad. It's just that it's going to take more than that. So still do those things. And also don't expect that if all you're doing is self-care in the way of activities that feel good in the moment, if that's all you're doing to address a sense of compassion, especially towards behavior change, that's not enough, right? We need that, but we also need other components if we really want change to sustain. So our relationships outside of therapy, or just any relationships that we have in life, even if you're not in therapy, are really going to determine how supported you feel in the change that you want to make in whatever behavior or habit it is. So if the relationships that are currently in your life are relationships that really support or even benefit from an old behavior that you're wanting to change, you're going to find that very, very difficult for that change to sustain. If nothing else changes in your life, if your relationships or the structures of your life don't change, it's going to be very difficult to sustain a behavioral change because you have no support for that, right?
Yeah, I mean, I thought of this like image of a flower. I don't know who here, waters a bunch of plants and is familiar with gardening, but if anybody's a gardener, they understand that when they see one of their flowers in their garden starting to wilt, it's not thriving. Generally what this person is going to start assessing is like, what's going on with the soil? Is it getting enough sunlight? Is it getting enough water? What's happening in the environment of the flower that I can do something different to help it thrive? It's never about how can I change this flower to make it be better with the sunlight and the water that it's currently getting. I'm not going to change the soil, so how can I change this flower? And that's kind of this like parallel imagery that I'm getting while you're speaking here. It's really about environment. It's really about looking at what you can change in your life, not just what you can change inside. It's all acting together, working together, and harmony will be quite difficult to achieve. In other words, for this flower, the flower is going to continue to have a hard time if something in its environment stays the same.
Yeah.
You mentioned like in addition to these tips that aren't necessarily bad, but sometimes not adequate and sufficient enough to get you where you want to be, there are other things that folks will probably want to focus their energy on when it comes to self-care. So I was wondering if you could share some of those things. Like some people may feel like they're not really sure how to care for themselves other than some of these tips that we're all familiar with. So what would you say are some of the stuff that a lot of folks aren't thinking about when it comes to self-care?
What a good question. stuff that folks aren't thinking about when it comes to self-care. So I'm going to answer this question in more of a generic way, and then hopefully get specific. I think for me, when clients come to see me and they say, what can I do for XYZ issue? What can I do for anxiety? What can I do for depression? One of the first questions that I ask, or the first topics of conversation, is tell me more about what that is for you. We use these big sweeping categories to describe mental health issues. And to a certain extent, that's really important to share with others, that there are some experiences that really are collective, such as stress and anxiety or depression, that we have a general category for that deserves help. And this is generally what it looks and sounds like. But the exact feeling of anxiety is so individual, person to person, right? And a lot of this has to do with digging deeper. If we say, okay, I'm a person who experiences anxiety in my life, if all we do is call it anxiety and we never actually talk about the thoughts and the feelings behind the anxiety, and maybe even connect to memories about when I first noticed these thoughts and feelings, to understand why these thoughts and feelings exist, right? This is that same piece around, in my practice, I assume that every behavior exists for a reason. Same thing with thoughts and feelings. Every thought, every feeling exists for a reason. So if we don't have a more detailed description about what it is that we're really struggling with, and maybe some ideas about where that comes from, then we're going to struggle to do the right techniques and use the right tools to really tend to those feelings and take care of ourselves in a deeper sense. The good news is, like, this is one of the reasons why therapy exists. So if you're listening to this interview and you're really struggling to come up with your why this is happening, like, why do I experience depression, or why do I experience anxiety? Or you're stopping at, like, this is just something that's fundamentally wrong with me. I'm a depressed person, or I'm an anxious person, and there's no changing that. That might be a really good reason to start working with a therapist, so that you can dig deeper with someone who's going to guide you along that process, right? It is a windy path, and it's much easier to look in a mirror and see what's going on with your reflection, rather than trying to guess at your reflection without a mirror. So a therapist is a great mirror for folks for this reason. So for me, asking about what are some great self-care tips as a generic advice would start with, like, gain some self-awareness. Really work on, when you're struggling with something, really work on pausing and feeling your body and being able to describe what's happening from a place of sensation. Because essentially, self-care, particularly in those moments where I need to do something right now, I'm super stressed out, or I'm super low, or whatever that might be, self-care is literally about tending to the physical body. So if you notice that stress shows up for you as an increased heart rate and shortness of breath, then I might work with that person on changing heart rate and changing breath patterns. And yeah, that can look like deep breathing and meditation. But for some people, if stress is showing up as a physical tension in the body, it's not possible to take a deep breath. So we might actually work on some clench and release, like hold your breath until you can't hold it anymore, and then giant exhale, right? Or we might work with doing something that seems counterintuitive, like, oh, is your heart beating really fast? Try doing some jumping jacks in place until you exhaust your heart rate. Because guess what? We can't sustain a high heart rate. We can't sustain a shortness of breath. So we can either help change that physical sensation through manipulating it, like through increasing the heart rate or increasing the shortness of breath until we can't possibly sustain it any longer. Or we can let it pass on its own, which might take a little bit longer. So a lot of self-care tips are literally about caring for the self that is the body, as opposed to trying to challenge your thoughts. Because usually, we talked about this, right? When the brain is stressed out, it shuts down our access to our intellectual and creative parts of self. So the only thoughts we're going to have in a high stress moment are going to be thoughts that reflect high stress feelings. They're not actually going to be our creative or intellectual parts of self, right? So, self care for me is really about tending to feeling enough to get the brain back in a place where it's feeling safe again. And then we can conceptualize of our wellness, our values, our visions for our life, our aspirational identities from that low scale stress place, and from a place that is really a lot more connected to a greater sense of what we value, what we want out of life.
Thank you. These are fantastic tips. And like you said, some of it can feel when we think about it counterintuitive. Because what I'm hearing is like it is important for us to get to some place in our lives where we're able to sit with ourselves, sit with our thoughts, sit with the discomfort that often comes with anxiety, with depressive symptoms. And being able to do that is hard, right? Like we have so much stimulation in this world that we can turn to try to distract ourselves, numb ourselves, and not feel that stuff. And some people might even say some of those things are forms of self-care. So that can be a bit questionable at times. And really, it's about when we care for ourselves. It's not always about feeling really, really good in that moment. Is what I'm understanding. Self-care is really putting in intentional effort to nurture who we are. And sometimes that will look like sitting with discomfort, sitting with pain, learning to express that pain in ways that make sense, that are healthy for you, safe for the
Mm,
people around you.
yeah.
Um, and these are certainly things that I don't think a lot of people are thinking of as the first top three things they're going to do as their self care resolutions this year. So
Yeah.
I really appreciate you um, putting it together in this way.
Yeah. And I think
Um,
it's a little both and. I talk to
yeah.
my clients about the volume dial. And voluming down would be what we tend to think of as coping skills.
Mhm.
And coping skills are our fancy way of saying avoidance skills. And there's nothing wrong with that for me, because you know what? Life is hard. And sometimes we want to catch a break, and we should
Mhm.
be permitted to catch a break, right? And then volume up is more the expressing skills, the pausing, feeling, being in the feeling, learning to expand our capacity to be uncomfortable, right? That kind of stuff. Or a big expression of the intensity of a feeling, right? For me, my goal as a therapist is not to tell clients what to do, but to give clients full control of that volume dial. So for me, this is inherently about choice and being able to freely choose. I think and this is actually what drives a lot of people towards wanting to change behavior. I think where it gets tricky is when we do things with like volume down and volume up without a whole lot of intention, right? So we immediately move towards coping skills or numbing activities without pausing to notice what's happening. If I pause and I notice that I'm really, really uncomfortable in my body, there might be many reasons that I would want to numb from that. Like, for instance, if I'm in a business meeting, not really the right time for me to have a big cry. Right? Or if I'm with people I just don't fully trust, or if the thing that I'm feeling, there's like some fear around it, like this feeling feels really big and I don't know how deep it goes or where it comes from, and I'm not ready. So there's many good reasons that we would want to volume down. For me, what's important is that piece of self-awareness. That way, everyone can intentionally make the choice to say, all right, I'm going to numb out from this because it's not the right time or I'm not ready, whatever the reason, right? Or now I'm ready to engage in this. I'm going to volume up. I'm going to journal about it. I'm going to talk about it with someone. I'm going to take these risks of self expression in the feeling. So for me, I think that there is a really important aspect of self care that we are learning to build self trust through taking control of that volume dial and not judging our actions to volume down more harshly than our actions to volume up, but learning to trust that there are many good reasons to volume down and many good reasons to volume up. And the goal is just to be really intentional about what I want so that I know what I'm going to get.
Love that so much. And it fits into, the thing that you said about how there is no one right way to do therapy, to find healing for yourself, to thrive in your existence, navigating our world. The windy road looks different for all of us. And um, I mean, I'm concluding here with I can see why a lot of your friends' family want you to be their therapist. So, Julie, I really appreciate you and your wisdom here and sharing these wonderful insights with all of us, with me. And Want to see if there's anything final that you'd like to add as a closing comment or places that folks can find you.
Thank you. I think I'd like to conclude by just repeating that behavior change is incredibly difficult. And one of the things that makes it so difficult is that it's way more complicated than just doing something different from a place of action. So keep in mind that if you're someone who's ready to try something different, to change some behaviors, especially old habits, keep in mind that this is hard work, that you don't have to do it by yourself, that there will be a windy path of many wins and many gains and many losses and many mistakes. And you don't have to do it perfectly. So remember that it's hard, and remember that you don't have to do it alone.